High above the marble floor of the Sistine Chapel, where whispers dissolve into stone and incense lingers in the air, a ceiling opens into the illusion of heaven. Figures move across it: prophets, sibyls, ignudi, the first man reaching toward his creator. In the center, two hands almost touch. The space between them, no wider than a breath, holds centuries of wonder. But beneath that painted sky, there once stood a solitary man. He lay on wooden scaffolding, suspended in dim light, his neck bent backward for hours, then days, then years. Wet plaster dripped toward his face. Line dust settled into his lungs. His body ached. His eyesight blurred. Rome slept below him, while he remained awake, brush in hand, wrestling with Genesis. He did not consider himself a painter. He believed he was a sculptor, a man of stone, of hammer and chisel. And yet here he was, asked to turn a ceiling into scripture. What kind of mind can imagine marble figures trapped inside rock and then lift entire worlds into the sky? What kind of spirit carries both divine beauty and relentless dissatisfaction? Tonight, we enter the life of Michelangelo Buonarroti. Born in 1475 in a small Tuscan village, raised among quarries and cathedrals, shaped by faith, rivalry, ambition, and solitude. This is not only the story of the man who painted the Sistine Chapel, it is the story of a restless Renaissance soul, one who carved eternity from stone and painted humanity into heaven. If you find calm in slow history and meaning in the quiet corners of the past, consider subscribing and gently joining this growing circle of listeners. And as we begin, tell me in the comments, which Renaissance masterpiece has stayed with you the longest? Now, let us step back into Florence. Chapter 1. A Child of Stone and Silence. Michelangelo Buonarroti was born on March 6, 1475, in the small hill town of Caprese in the Republic of Florence, a rugged landscape of stone houses, narrow roads, and distant blue mountains softened by Tuscan light. His father, Ludovico di Leonardo Buonarroti, was a minor government official, proud of the family's old name, but limited means. He believed his son should pursue a respectable profession: law, trade, administration. Art, in his view, belonged to craftsmen, not gentlemen. It was labor, not legacy. His mother, Francesca, was often ill. When Michelangelo was only 6 years old, she died. The loss left no recorded outcry, no written confession of grief, only a silence that seemed to follow him through life. Many years later, his friends would note how rarely he spoke of childhood, as if the earliest part of his world had already hardened into something wordless. For a time, he was sent to live with a family of stonecutters in Settignano, a village near Florence known for its quarries. There, the rhythm of his days was not shaped by books or conversation, but by the sound of iron striking marble. Dust hung in the air like pale mist. Stone blocks lay half-formed in the sun. Men spoke little and worked steadily. Michelangelo would later say that he had drunk in the love of sculpture with his nurse's milk. Whether memory or myth, the image holds truth. His earliest sensory world was tactile: weight, texture, resistance. Stone was not cold to him. It was alive with hidden possibility. When he returned to Florence, The city itself became his silent tutor. Churches opened into painted heavens. Public squares displayed statues of saints and heroes. Grief, faith, power, and beauty were carved and painted onto every surface. For most children, these were decorations. For Michelangelo, they were presences. He studied faces in crowds, the curve of a shoulder, the tension of a hand, the bend of a neck in prayer. He watched light move across stone walls at dusk. He noticed the way sorrow changed posture, how hope lifted the chin. His attention lingered where others passed by. He was not a loud child, nor playful in the usual sense. Those around him sensed intensity, a seriousness beyond his years, as though he were already listening for something beneath the visible world. Before he ever touched chisel or brush, Michelangelo had begun learning his first language, the language of form, silence, and the human body as a vessel of the soul. Chapter 2. Florence, the School of Beauty and Power. By the late 1480s, Florence was not merely a city. It was an idea unfolding in stone and colour. Cathedrals rose above tiled roofs. Workshops hummed with apprentices, grinding pigments and stretching canvases. Philosophers debated Plato beneath vaulted ceilings. Bankers funded churches as monuments to both faith and influence. It was the beating heart of the Renaissance. At 13, Michelangelo persuaded his reluctant father to allow him to apprentice under Domenico Ghirlandaio, one of Florence's most respected fresco painters. It was an unusual concession. Ludovico had resisted fiercely. To him, art was manual labor, but Michelangelo's persistence, sharp, unwavering, left little room for compromise. In Ghirlandaio's workshop, discipline replaced childhood wandering. He learned how to prepare plaster for fresco, how to draw swiftly and accurately, how to copy masterworks line by line. The environment was practical, almost industrial. Assistants worked in coordinated silence. Walls filled gradually with biblical scenes, commissioned by wealthy patrons. Yet even among older apprentices, Michelangelo's hand moved differently. He drew not only outlines, but tension. His figures seemed to contain breath. Muscles flexed beneath charcoal lines. He studied the human body obsessively, not for decoration, but for structure. He wanted to understand how flesh wrapped bone, how movement began before it appeared. Within a year, Ghirlandaio reportedly recognized that the young apprentice had little left to learn from him. It was then that Michelangelo entered a rarer circle, the Garden Academy of Lorenzo de' Medici. Lorenzo, known as Il Magnifico, ruled Florence not as a crowned king, but as a cultural architect. In his palace gardens stood ancient Roman sculptures collected from across Italy. These were not religious icons. They were remnants of a lost classical world. Gods, athletes, mythic heroes, carved with anatomical precision. Here, Michelangelo studied under Bertoldo di Giovanni, a sculptor trained in the tradition of Donatello. For the first time, he worked directly from marble fragments of antiquity. He traced the lines of broken torsos. He measured proportions with his fingers. He copied not just shape, but weight and balance. More importantly, within Lorenzo's household, he encountered humanist scholars who spoke of beauty as divine order. They read Plato aloud. They argued that the human body reflected heavenly harmony. Art, they believed, was not imitation, it was revelation. Michelangelo listened. In these gardens, the world shifted. Art was no longer craft alone. It was philosophy made visible. It was the search for eternal truth within temporary flesh. A realization began to take root inside him. Stone was not something to shape. It was something to uncover. Chapter 3. The birth of a relentless identity. The world that had nurtured Michelangelo's early awakening did not remain stable for long. In 1492, Lorenzo de' Medici died. Florence, once balanced between commerce, classical revival, and artistic patronage, shifted into uncertainty. Soon after, the Dominican friar Girolamo Savonarola rose to prominence, preaching fiery sermons against moral corruption and worldly excess. Luxury became suspect. Paintings and fine objects were cast into public bonfires. Even beauty itself seemed to stand trial. For a young artist shaped by both Christian devotion and admiration for ancient sculpture, the atmosphere felt fractured. The harmony of Lorenzo's court, where philosophy and art had mingled with confidence, dissolved into anxiety and reform. Patronage weakened. Political structures trembled. The future no longer appeared guided by measured humanism, but by divine warning. Michelangelo was barely out of adolescence when stability vanished beneath him. He moved first to Bologna, then to Rome, not as a celebrated master, but as a young sculptor seeking commissions wherever opportunity flickered. Work came irregularly. Payments were uncertain. Reputation had to be carved as deliberately as marble itself. These wandering years shaped more than skill. They shaped temperament. Beneath the surface of his ambition lay a tension that reached back to his childhood. Michelangelo's father, Lodovico Buonarroti, came from a family that valued its modest, noble lineage. Manual labor, even artistic labor, stood uncomfortably close to trade. Sculpture required dust, physical exertion, and tools. It did not resemble the dignified civic roles his father imagined. The disapproval was not always loud, but it was present. For Michelangelo, art became more than craft. It became elevation. If he was to strike stone like a mason, then he would do so in a way that forced the world to recognize intellect within the labor. He would not remain a hired artisan. He would stand as a mind shaping matter. That resolve hardened into pride. He distrusted ease. He rejected compromise. When criticized, he did not soften his approach. He intensified it. His figures grew more muscular, charged with tension rather than decorative grace. Where others sought elegance and smoothness, he searched for underlying structure, bone beneath flesh, force beneath posture. He was not interested in pleasing viewers. He wanted to reveal the architecture of humanity itself. Florence had taught him admiration for classical proportion. Rome taught him scale. But instability taught him something deeper: self-reliance. In competitive artistic circles, praise could vanish quickly. Reputation fluctuated with patron favor. Michelangelo responded by turning inward, setting standards no patron could lower and no applause could satisfy. Stories from this period describe him living simply, sometimes poorly. He slept little. He wore the same clothes for extended stretches, indifferent to appearance. Comfort seemed irrelevant, even suspicious. What mattered was the block of marble before him, and the conviction that something waited within it. An idea took hold that would define his life. The sculptor does not invent the figure. The sculptor frees it. Each strike of the chisel became an act of removal, not addition. Stone allowed no correction once cut too deeply. Error meant loss. Irreversibility demanded certainty. This discipline aligned with his character, intense, uncompromising, almost severe. Yet the struggle was not solely material. He questioned his own worth relentlessly. Poverty did not frighten him as much as mediocrity. Even small successes felt insufficient. A completed work rarely satisfied him. He saw flaws invisible to others. This satisfaction did not weaken him. It fueled him. If something seemed adequate, he distrusted it. If praised, he examined it more harshly. Rest implied stagnation. Ease suggested decline. In these uncertain, wandering years, Michelangelo ceased to be merely a gifted apprentice. He became a man defined by an inward standard that no patron could dictate and no public acclaim could calm. The Renaissance celebrated harmony in the human form. Michelangelo pursued the storm within it. Chapter 4. Marble made flesh. The Pietà. Rome, at the end of the 15th century, was a city rebuilding its image. Pilgrims flowed toward its churches. Cardinals competed through architecture and art, commissioning works that would honor faith and display influence. Into this world arrived a young sculptor from Florence, little known, proud, and carrying the quiet intensity of someone certain of his own direction, even if the world had not yet noticed. In 1498, Michelangelo received a commission from a French cardinal, Jean de Billers, to carve a sculpture for his funeral chapel in St. Peter's Basilica. The subject was familiar in Northern Europe, but rare in Italy. The Virgin Mary holding the body of Christ after the crucifixion. The Pietà. He chose a single block of Carrara marble, luminous and flawless. For months, he worked largely in solitude, his process hidden behind workshop walls. Hammer strikes echoed softly through Rome's streets, unnoticed among the city's many labors. But what emerged was unlike anything Rome had seen. Mary does not collapse under grief. She sits composed, youthful, almost impossibly serene. Her drapery falls in vast, calm folds, forming a stable pyramid. Across her lap lies the body of Christ, lifeless, yet rendered with such delicacy that marble seems to breathe. The skin appears soft. Veins rest beneath the surface. The weight of death is felt not in horror, but in stillness. Viewers who entered the chapel fell silent. They had seen religious sculpture before. They had seen suffering, drama, devotion. But here was something else. Sorrow without distortion, beauty without theatricality. The tragedy of the scene was balanced by a strange, luminous peace. And the sculptor was only in his early 20s. Rumors spread quickly. Some refused to believe a young Florentine could have achieved such mastery. The work was attributed to others. One night, overhearing visitors credit another artist, Michelangelo returned to the chapel after dark. Taking chisel and mallet, he carved his name across the sash running over Mary's chest. Michelangelo Buonarroti, Florentine, made this. It was the only work he would ever sign. The gesture was not vanity alone. It was declaration. He had stepped onto the stage of history, not through noise, but through marble. With the Pietà, Michelangelo proved that stone could convey tenderness as convincingly as flesh. Grief could be quiet. Divinity could be human. And beauty, when shaped with absolute conviction, could suspend time itself. Rome had gained a masterpiece. Michelangelo had gained a voice the world could no longer ignore. Chapter 5. The Giant Awakened. David and the language of tension. When Michelangelo returned to Florence in 1501, he encountered a problem that had waited for decades. In the courtyard of the cathedral workshop lay a massive block of Carrara marble, over 5 meters tall, weathered, narrow, and considered ruined. 2 earlier sculptors had attempted to work it and abandoned the effort. The stone had earned a nickname, Il Gigante, the giant. Most saw waste. Michelangelo saw a figure waiting. He secured the commission and had the block moved inside a sheltered space. For more than 2 years, he worked in controlled isolation. No large workshop bustled around him. No assistants shaped the form. The relationship was direct, man and stone. The subject was David, the biblical youth who defeated Goliath. Florentine tradition typically showed the hero after victory, triumphant, sword in hand, enemy defeated. Michelangelo chose another moment entirely. His David does not celebrate. He watches. The body stands in poised stillness, weight shifted, muscles alert, but not yet engaged. The sling rests over one shoulder. The right hand hangs large, veins pronounced. The brow tightens slightly. The neck turns. The eyes focus on something distant, the unseen giant. It is the psychology before action. This was Michelangelo's emerging language. He did not sculpt events. He sculpted inner states. Tension lived beneath the skin. Energy coiled within stillness. The body became a stage for spiritual and emotional drama. The proportions were bold, even controversial. Hands and head are slightly enlarged. From close range, the anatomy seems heightened. But placed high against the sky, the figure resolves into perfect balance. Michelangelo understood not only form, but perception. How the eye reads scale, distance, and force. When David was unveiled in 1504, Florence was stunned. The statue stood not inside a church, but in the Piazza della Signoria, before the seat of government. It became more than art. It became a symbol of the Republic, small yet defiant, watchful against larger powers. With David, Michelangelo separated himself decisively from prevailing ideals of gentle harmony. His figures were not passive beauties. They were charged presences, bodies containing thought, will, and destiny. Stone no longer appeared carved. It appeared awakened. Chapter 6. Against the Current. Rivalry, Expectation, and Resistance. Success did not bring Michelangelo ease. It brought pressure. Florence and Rome at the turn of the 16th century were arenas of ambition. Artists were no longer anonymous craftsmen. They were public figures, competing for prestige, commissions, and influence. Patrons compared them. Citizens debated them. Reputation became currency. Michelangelo's temperament did not suit this environment. He was not graceful in conversation, nor eager to charm. He distrusted flattery and avoided courtly manners. While others cultivated networks, he cultivated intensity. This set him apart, and set him against expectations of how a celebrated artist should behave. Rivalry sharpened the atmosphere. Leonardo da Vinci, older and already renowned, embodied a different ideal. Elegant, experimental, socially fluid. Raphael, younger, diplomatic, and admired for clarity and grace, rose quickly in Rome. Their works were praised for balance and beauty that seemed effortless. Michelangelo's art, by contrast, was forceful, muscular, and psychologically charged. His figures strained, twisted, and bore visible tension. Critics sometimes called them excessive, even unnatural. Where Raphael offered serenity, Michelangelo offered struggle. He did not correct them. At the same time, the role of the artist itself was changing. The Renaissance elevated art intellectually, yet many patrons still viewed artists as skilled laborers bound to instruction. Michelangelo resisted this. He argued with patrons, delayed projects, altered plans. He believed the work must follow an inner necessity, not simply a contract. This defiance had consequences. Commissions were threatened, relationships frayed. He quarreled with city officials, with fellow artists, and eventually with powerful church leaders. His pride, inseparable from his vision, made collaboration difficult. Beneath these outward conflicts lay a deeper tension: the purpose of art. Was art meant to please the eye, to decorate sacred spaces gently? Or was it meant to confront the viewer with the full weight of the human condition? Strength, vulnerability, fear, divine longing. Michelangelo chose the second path. In doing so, he pushed beyond accepted norms. His bodies grew more monumental, his gestures more dramatic. Beauty, in his hands, included strain and unrest. Harmony did not exclude conflict, it contained it. The Renaissance celebrated proportion. Michelangelo revealed pressure within proportion, the sense that every human form stands at the edge of action, of choice, of destiny. The world admired him, but it did not always understand him. Chapter 7. The Weight Within. Solitude, Faith, and Restlessness. For all the public commissions and marble triumphs, Michelangelo's most enduring battles were not fought in workshops or city squares. They were fought within. He never married. He formed close attachments, some deeply affectionate, some intellectually intense. Yet he guarded his private life fiercely. Letters and poems that survive from later years reveal longing, admiration, and spiritual yearning, but they also suggest distance. Intimacy, for him, was safer on paper than in daily life. He preferred solitude. Visitors described his living conditions as sparse, even austere. He wore the same boots until they softened around his feet. He ate simply, often forgetting meals while absorbed in work. Comfort seemed irrelevant. His true occupation was internal, wrestling with expectation, his own and God's. Faith in Renaissance Italy was not an abstract idea. It permeated politics, art, and daily existence. Michelangelo believed deeply in divine judgment. He feared moral failure. He questioned whether artistic ambition bordered on pride. Could creating monumental human forms verge on idolatry? Could beauty distract from salvation? These concerns did not weaken his art. They intensified it. His notebooks reveal a man who never felt finished, not only with projects, but with himself. Even after acclaim, he described his works as inadequate. He saw flaws where others saw mastery. Praise brought no lasting peace. There were moments of profound fatigue. Long commissions drained him physically and mentally. He complained of pain in his joints, in his back, in his eyes. The body that sculpted heroic forms was itself fragile, aging, imperfect. And yet, he could not stop. Work was not merely occupation. It was necessity, almost penitence. To carve was to discipline the self. To draw was to search for clarity. If the soul felt unsettled, the hand moved faster. Those who knew him sometimes found him abrupt, irritable, even severe. But beneath the stern exterior lay sensitivity, sharpened by loss and expectation. The death of friends affected him deeply. Political instability in Florence troubled him. The corruption he perceived within institutions disturbed him. He carried the world heavily. Michelangelo did not separate art from conscience. Each figure he shaped carried more than anatomy. It carried tension between flesh and spirit. His own unrest translated into bodies that seemed to strain towards something just beyond reach. The Renaissance often celebrated balance and serenity. Michelangelo lived in imbalance, between devotion and doubt, pride and humility, isolation and longing. And it was this inner pressure, more than external rivalry, that shaped the intensity of everything he created. Chapter 8. Painting the Heavens, the Sistine Ordeal. In 1508, Michelangelo received a summons that would alter the course of his life and the visual language of Western art. Pope Julius II, formidable in will and ambition, had once engaged him for a grand sculptural tomb, a project of vast scale and symbolic power. That commission faltered amid shifting politics and finances, leaving both artist and patron dissatisfied. Then came a new command. Michelangelo was to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. He resisted immediately. He was, in his own mind, a sculptor. Fresco demanded a different mastery, chemistry of pigments, speed across wet plaster before it dried, planning compositions in reverse across curved surfaces. He suspected the assignment may have been encouraged by rivals who hoped to see him falter publicly in Rome. But refusal to a pope was not an option. The initial scheme called for a simple arrangement of apostles. Michelangelo reimagined it into a vast theological cosmos. 9 central scenes from Genesis, from the separation of light and darkness to the story of Noah. Around them would sit prophets of Israel and sibyls of the ancient world, figures bridging sacred revelation and classical wisdom. Painted architecture would frame the vision, transforming the flat vault into an illusion of depth and structure. Scaffolding rose high above the marble floor. Wooden platforms curved with the chapel's vault, suspending him in a narrow world of boards, lime, and sky-tinted plaster. He did not lie on his back, as later legend imagined. He stood, body leaning backward for hours, neck strained, arms lifted. Below him, the chapel floor seemed distant, almost unreal. The air carried the sharp scent of wet lime. Plaster had to be laid fresh each day, a section small enough to paint before it set. Pigments mixed with water soaked into the surface, binding color into the wall itself. Mistakes could not be erased easily. The work demanded both physical endurance and relentless foresight. Drops of lime and paint fell onto his face and clothes. Candlelight flickered against damp surfaces during early hours. The curved ceiling altered perspective, forcing him to calculate how figures would appear from far below. In letters, he described swollen joints, aching back, and vision blurred by constant upward strain. At times, the task seemed less commission than trial. He dismissed many assistants, unwilling to surrender control of essential passages. The scale required a team. His temperament demanded authorship. Days lengthened into months, months into years. The early sections revealed experimentation. Colors adjusted, poses grew bolder. Then the work gathered momentum, as though the vast surface itself had begun to speak his language. The ceiling became a theatre of human form. In The Creation of Adam, God surges forward, born within a mantle that billows like a living cloud. His arm extends with electric purpose. Adam reclines upon the earth, newly formed, body relaxed yet expectant. Their fingers near one another, separated by a space no wider than breath. In that interval lives the mystery of existence. Life poised between divine impulse and human reception. Elsewhere, prophets sit monumental, draped in thought as much as cloth. Their bodies twist with the weight of vision. Sibyls, seers from the classical world, share the sacred space, embodying a Renaissance belief that truth echoes across cultures. Youthful figures, the ignudi, frame the scenes with effortless strength, their presence less narrative than celebratory, the body as divine instrument. The vault no longer felt like architecture. It felt like sky. Scripture unfolded not as distant story, but as physical drama. Muscle conveyed meaning. Gesture carried theology. The sacred entered through anatomy. When the chapel reopened in 1512, visitors stepped beneath the painted canopy and stopped. The images did not sit politely above them. They pressed downward, enlarging the space, dissolving stone into atmosphere. Silence often came first, then murmurs. Michelangelo, exhausted, did not indulge in triumph. He saw imperfections invisible to others. Yet something irreversible had occurred. He had entered as a reluctant painter. He emerged having expanded the limits of what painting could contain. The man who believed his destiny bound to marble had lifted humanity toward heaven with pigment and plaster. Through color, light, and the unbearable tension held in the narrow space between two almost touching hands. Chapter 9. Fame Without Rest. When the Sistine Chapel ceiling was unveiled, Rome changed its tone when speaking Michelangelo's name. Visitors entered, craned their necks, and left altered. Artists sketched fragments obsessively. Word traveled beyond Italy, carried by letters, travelers, and engravings. Michelangelo was no longer merely a master sculptor. He was something rarer, a figure whose work redefined what art could be. Recognition, at last, was undeniable. But recognition did not soften him. While admirers gathered, Michelangelo withdrew inward. Public praise felt distant, almost irrelevant. He returned quickly to unfinished obligations, especially the long-delayed tomb of Pope Julius II, a project that haunted him for decades in revised, reduced forms. What others saw as triumph, he experienced as incompletion. Fame brought demands. Popes, princes, and city officials sought his labor. Each commission carried negotiation, pressure, and expectation. He moved between Florence and Rome, rarely settled, often dissatisfied. Letters from this period reveal frustration with contracts, delays in payment, and the burden of scale. The world wanted monuments. He wanted integrity of vision. In Rome, younger artists studied the Sistine ceiling closely. Raphael's later works show its influence: stronger anatomy, deeper drama. Michelangelo knew this. His style was spreading, yet he did not lead a formal workshop or school. Influence radiated outward without his participation. He remained solitary. Contemporaries described him walking alone at night, lost in thought. He avoided lavish social life. Even in circles of power, he seemed separate, respected, sometimes feared, rarely at ease. His speech could be sharp, his patience thin. He expected from others the same intensity he demanded of himself. The paradox deepened. The more visible his art became, the more inward he turned. He did not seek to cultivate an image of genius. He lived simply, often in modest rooms, surrounded by drawings, tools, and blocks of stone. Comfort distracted, work clarified. To many, the Sistine Chapel marked the peak of a glorious career. To Michelangelo, it was another ascent that revealed a higher summit still out of reach. Recognition did not bring peace. It brought a sharper awareness of the distance between what he had achieved and what he believed possible. The world looked up at his painted heavens. He looked beyond them and saw only further labor. Chapter 10. The Public Giant and the Private Soul. By midlife, Michelangelo stood as a towering figure in the public imagination. His David guarded Florence. His Pietà drew pilgrims in Rome. The Sistine ceiling had altered the course of painting. To patrons and observers, he appeared almost mythic, the embodiment of Renaissance genius, capable of commanding stone and color with equal authority. Yet inside, the landscape was far less triumphant. Fame created a second life he never fully inhabited. Invitations, honors, and admiration surrounded him, but they moved around his work, not into his heart. He did not experience himself as a master standing at the summit. He experienced himself as a laborer still climbing. The tomb of Julius II remained a source of turmoil. Originally conceived as a vast sculptural program, it was repeatedly reduced, delayed, renegotiated. Michelangelo felt trapped between obligation and vision. The project symbolized a recurring wound, the world's expectations narrowing what he believed should be monumental. At the same time, his spiritual unease deepened. He reflected more often on mortality and judgment. The human body he rendered with such authority began to signify fragility as much as strength. Beauty was no longer sufficient. It had to point beyond itself. This inward turn altered his approach. Figures grew more complex, more twisted, as though shaped by invisible pressures. The balance of earlier works gave way to movement that seemed to strain against limits. Stone appeared less like a surface to perfect and more like resistance to overcome. Outwardly, his status rose. Popes entrusted him with architectural responsibilities, including work on St. Peter's Basilica. He was consulted not merely as an artisan, but as an authority whose judgment shaped Rome's physical future. Inwardly, he felt unfinished. He wrote poetry exploring the tension between earthly love and divine longing, between the visible and the eternal. These verses reveal humility unexpected in someone so celebrated. He spoke of error, of the soul trapped within flesh, of art as an imperfect bridge toward God. The public saw the giant. The private man felt small before infinity. This division did not paralyze him. It propelled him. The distance between outer acclaim and inner insufficiency became a kind of engine. He worked not to preserve reputation, but to resolve a question he could never fully answer: how to give material form to truths that exceeded material itself. In Michelangelo's life, greatness and dissatisfaction grew together, inseparable, driving him forward even as peace receded. Chapter 11. When Strength Becomes Effort. Time, which Michelangelo had long challenged through stone and paint, began to assert itself quietly within his own body. By his 60s and 70s, an advanced age for the 16th century, the physical force that had once seemed inexhaustible required negotiation. Hands that had controlled hammer and chisel with certainty grew stiff in the mornings. Long hours standing over work brought deeper fatigue. Climbing scaffolds, once a matter of will, demanded caution. Yet he did not speak of retirement. Work continued, though the rhythm changed. He paused more often. He revised designs repeatedly, as if certainty now arrived more slowly. Assistants took on greater practical roles, but he maintained control over essential decisions. Authority, for him, remained inseparable from responsibility. Rome itself was changing. Political tensions, shifting papal priorities, and the memory of past upheavals created an atmosphere less confident than the bold years of Julius II. Grand visions encountered financial limits. Plans narrowed. Michelangelo, who had always aimed beyond constraint, felt these reductions keenly. Letters from this period show a man aware of age, but unwilling to surrender to it. He described himself as old and tired, yet requests for new designs and revisions filled his days. The body protested. The mind remained restless. Physical decline brought not softness, but concentration. His later works show fewer decorative elements, fewer distractions. Forms became more essential, surfaces less polished. The energy that once surged outward in monumental display turned inward, seeking depth rather than breadth. He also grew more reflective. Death was no longer abstract theology, but approaching reality. Friends passed away. Familiar figures of his youth existed only in memory. The continuity of Florence and Rome outlasted individuals, and Michelangelo felt himself moving toward that same quiet disappearance. Still, each morning he returned to labor. If strength had once meant force, it now meant persistence, the refusal to abandon effort even when ease was gone. His art no longer sought to astonish through scale alone. It sought honesty, stripped of illusion. The Renaissance ideal of the powerful, balanced human form had shaped his early career. Now he confronted another truth. Even the strongest body yields to time. And yet, within that yielding, the will to create endured. Chapter 12. A World Moving Forward. While Michelangelo aged, art itself did not stand still. The harmonious balance that had defined the High Renaissance, clarity, proportion, calm authority, began to shift. A younger generation of artists absorbed its lessons and then bent them. Figures lengthened, poses grew more complex, even strained. Space became ambiguous. Beauty turned expressive rather than stable. This emerging style, later called mannerism, carried Michelangelo's influence deeply within it. Artists studied his twisting bodies, his muscular exaggerations, his charged compositions. But where his tension had grown from spiritual and psychological necessity, imitators sometimes adopted the surface without the source. Complexity became fashion. Difficulty became display. Michelangelo observed this transformation from a distance. He was revered as a living master, yet also stood slightly apart from the new direction. His work had opened doors, but he did not always recognize himself in what passed through them. The language he had forged through struggle now echoed in ways he had not intended. Rome, too, bore scars. The sack of Rome in 1527 had shaken confidence in humanist optimism. Faith remained central, but certainty had dimmed. Art responded with drama, intensity, and emotional charge. The serene equilibrium of earlier decades felt like memory. In this climate, Michelangelo was no longer simply an innovator. He was a monument. Younger artists approached him with reverence. Patrons invoked his name as a measure of excellence. Yet this veneration created distance. He belonged to an earlier dawn of the Renaissance, even as he continued working within a more unsettled twilight. Architecture occupied more of his attention, particularly his role in shaping St. Peter's Basilica. The shift from solitary carving to vast structural design mirrored a broader transition, from individual figure to encompassing space. His vision expanded even as the cultural moment fragmented. He did not chase novelty. He did not attempt to outpace youth. Instead, he moved deeper into his own concerns: faith, mortality, the soul's relationship to the divine. While the art world experimented outwardly, Michelangelo turned inward. The current of history flowed on. He remained in the river, but closer now to its source than to its surface movement, listening not to fashion, but to the quieter, older questions that had guided him from the beginning. Chapter 13. The Last Judgment of a Restless Soul. In 1536, more than 20 years after completing the Sistine Chapel ceiling, Michelangelo returned to the same sacred space, this time to cover the great altar wall. The world he stepped back into was no longer confident in the way it had once been. Rome still carried the memory of the sack of 1527, when violence and humiliation shook the city's sense of divine protection. Across Europe, the Protestant Reformation had fractured religious unity. The Catholic Church, entering what would become the Counter-Reformation, turned its attention towards doctrine, reform, and moral seriousness. Art, too, felt the weight of scrutiny. The commission given to Michelangelo was clear: a monumental last judgment. But the tone of the age ensured this would not be a serene vision. Unlike the measured narrative order of Genesis scenes above, this composition would not unfold gently from one moment to the next. It would surge, as though time itself had collapsed into a single, irreversible instant. Michelangelo removed earlier decorative elements from the wall and abandoned architectural illusion. In their place, he painted a vast, storming field of bodies, more than 300 figures, interwoven in motion. The background becomes sky not through perspective, but through density of form. The space seems less built than swirling. At the center stands Christ, not the tender teacher of Renaissance balance, but a figure of commanding authority. His arm lifts in a gesture that feels less like blessing than decree. The motion radiates outward, setting saints, angels, and souls into motion, as though gravity itself has changed direction. Beside him, the Virgin Mary turns inward, quieter, contemplative, a contrast to the dynamism around her. Saints hold the instruments of their martyrdom: keys, crosses, wheels, knives. Their calm faces do not soften the scene. They witness it. Below, the drama intensifies. The saved rise with visible effort, pulled upward by angels or grasping towards assistance. Muscles strain, limbs reach. No ascent appears effortless. On the other side, the damned descend in spirals of resistance and despair, bodies twisting as though caught in a current they cannot escape. The entire wall moves like a great tide. There is no tranquil symmetry here, no clear horizon. Figures overlap, rotate, and strain in every direction. Flesh, once the vehicle of Renaissance optimism, becomes the language of destiny. The human body carries not only beauty, but consequence. When the fresco was unveiled in 1541, reactions were immediate. Some viewers were overwhelmed by its intensity. Others objected to the abundance of nude figures in so sacred a setting, especially in an era of heightened moral vigilance. Criticism eventually led to draperies being painted over certain figures by Daniele da Volterra, a reminder that art, too, stood before judgment. This was not the work of a young artist celebrating human possibility. It was the work of an aging man confronting accountability. Michelangelo placed himself within the scene in a quiet, haunting way. In the flayed skin held by St. Bartholomew, many see a distorted self-portrait. The empty hide, slack and weightless, hangs as though identity itself has been shed. It is an image not of triumph, but of exposure. His sculpture from these years echoes the same inward turn. In the unfinished Pietà Rondanini, figures stretch upward, elongated and fragile, merging rather than separating. Surfaces remain rough. Chisel marks are visible. The marble seems less conquered than questioned. Completion matters less than truth. The marble no longer hides struggle. It reveals it. Michelangelo's late works speak quietly but heavily. They do not announce glory. They contemplate reckoning. The soul measured not by achievement, but by what remains when form dissolves. In returning to the Sistine Chapel, he did not paint another ascent toward creation. He painted humanity, suspended between rise and fall, and, with unflinching honesty, placed himself among them. Chapter 14. Narrowing Circles. In his final decades, Michelangelo's world grew smaller in appearance, though not in depth. He no longer moved through Rome with the urgency of earlier years. Public ceremonies, artistic rivalries, and courtly gatherings held little attraction. His reputation was secure. His name required no defense. What remained was work and the quiet spaces around it. He lived simply, almost austerely, in modest rooms near his projects. Visitors noted the absence of luxury. Drawings lay scattered among tools and papers. Stone fragments rested in corners. The environment felt less like a celebrated master's residence than a place of continuous labor. His circle of close companions narrowed. Friendships that endured were often spiritual or intellectual rather than social. Letters reveal thoughtful exchanges about faith, the soul, and the struggle to reconcile earthly effort with divine grace. The concerns of youth, rivalry, recognition, public position, receded. Reflection took their place. Architecture occupied much of his attention, especially his leadership in the design of St. Peter's Basilica's dome. Though the project would not be completed in his lifetime, he shaped its essential form. Even here, the work was not decorative, but structural. an enclosing gesture, a vast curve meant to shelter worshippers beneath a unified space. Yet as years passed, his direct engagement with large-scale execution lessened. Assistants and successors carried forward practical tasks. Michelangelo guided, corrected, and revised, but increasingly from a position slightly removed from physical strain. In sculpture, he turned toward intimate, unfinished forms. The late Pietà variations show figures merging, almost dissolving into one another. Surfaces remain rough, edges unresolved. The emphasis shifts from outward perfection to inward meaning. The viewer senses the artist's hand pausing, reconsidering, allowing incompletion to speak. His daily life became rhythm rather than event, rising, working, writing, praying, resting. The vast public world that had once pressed upon him now felt distant, like sound heard through thick walls. This withdrawal was not retreat born of defeat. It was concentration. Freed from the need to prove, he moved toward essentials: faith, form, and the question that had followed him since youth: how to shape matter so that spirit could be felt within it. The circles of his life narrowed. At their center remained the same quiet struggle between stone, soul, and the space between them. Chapter 15. The Final Quiet. In the winter of 1564, Rome moved through its familiar rhythms. Bells marking hours, footsteps echoing along stone streets, voices rising from markets and courtyards. Within a modest residence not far from his work, Michelangelo Buonarroti lay in his 89th year. Age had thinned his body, but not entirely his will. Until near the end, he had continued to draw, to revise architectural plans, to think through problems of form and faith. Work had long been the structure of his days. To stop completely was almost unimaginable. Yet the slowing had come. Those around him saw that strength now flickered rather than burned steadily. Movements were careful. Rest lasted longer. Conversations drifted toward the soul, toward readiness rather than ambition. The urgency that once drove him to outpace time softened into watchfulness. There was no grand public scene, no dramatic farewell. The end approached as quietly as many of his beginnings had been, without spectacle, within walls that had witnessed years of solitary labor. He spoke of returning to Florence in burial, to the city of his formation. Assistants and friends remained near, aware they were in the presence not of legend, but of a tired human being whose life had been shaped by effort more than ease. On February 18th, 1564, Michelangelo died. The hands that had struck marble with unyielding precision rested. The eyes that had measured proportion against imagination closed. The mind that had wrestled with beauty, judgment, and divine order fell still. In that room, there were no towering statues, no painted ceilings, only the quiet of an ordinary human departure. For nearly 9 decades, he had lived between stone and sky, between human limitation and boundless aspiration. He had known rivalry, faith, doubt, exhaustion, and moments when form seemed to yield to vision. Through all of it, he remained what he had always been, a worker, confronting material and self with equal intensity. Death did not arrive as an interruption of glory. It came as the final pause in a long labor. The man who had carved heroes and painted prophets left the world as he had moved through it, without ornament, carrying inward questions that no chisel could fully answer. Epilogue, where stone still breathes. When Michelangelo died in 1564, the Renaissance did not end, but it changed. His body was carried from Rome to Florence, the city that had shaped him. There he was honored not as a craftsman, but as something newly defined in European history. The artist as intellectual force, as visionary, as solitary architect of worlds. His influence moved swiftly and deeply. Sculptors studied his David to understand how tension could inhabit stillness. Painters traced the dynamic anatomy of the Sistine ceiling, absorbing its scale and daring. Architects looked to his dome for structural clarity joined with spiritual symbolism. Even those who reacted against his intensity defined themselves in relation to it. The human body in Western art would never again be merely decorative. After Michelangelo, it carried psychology, theology, struggle, and aspiration within its musculature. His works remain, not as relics behind glass, but as living presences. Visitors still stand beneath the Sistine Chapel and tilt their heads upward. They still pause before the Pietà, observing how cold marble conveys tenderness. In Florence, David still stands alert, gaze fixed beyond the present moment. Museums and churches protect these creations, yet their power lies not in preservation alone. It lies in recognition. Across centuries, viewers continue to see themselves reflected in those bodies. Strength mixed with vulnerability, beauty inseparable from strain. Modern artists, filmmakers, and architects echo his vocabulary of form, sometimes knowingly, sometimes not. The idea of the creative genius, solitary, driven, uncompromising, owes much to the life he embodied. And yet, beyond monument and myth, what endures most quietly is this. He believed that within stone there was something waiting to be revealed. Perhaps that belief extends beyond marble. Perhaps within every life, something waits beneath resistance. Form within formlessness, meaning within weight. If tonight's journey through Florence and Rome brought you a sense of stillness or wonder, consider subscribing and returning for another passage through history's quieter corridors. And as you leave this story, imagine once more that narrow space between two reaching hands, the place where creation begins.